session 2 of this faith group study on David, a man after God's own heart. Today we're going to focus on what I think is hands down the best known episode from David's story, his battle against Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. And I think it's best known because it has such appeal for people. It's a classic case of the underdog going up against a greater power. And we tend to love underdog stories. It also appeals to children. As a young child defeats this huge grown-up, and that's, of course, why it appears often in Sunday school lessons. But it's also just an inspiring story of great courage and shrewdness and great strategy. And yet, just because it is so appealing, I think this is an account that's very easy to distort or to oversimplify. I mean, sometimes David's fight against Goliath is just turned into a kind of moral tale of persisting against all the odds. Other times, it's made to be all about David, his courage, his strategy, his faith, his heroism. Other times, in a kind of pious overreaction to that, it's turned into being not at all about David. That his faith in God meant that he was really just kind of a pawn or a vessel for God, who was the one who really acted. But the actual account of 1 Kings 17, within the context of David's whole story, is more complex and subtle and multi-layered than that. The theme word that we chose for this session is courage. And certainly David did demonstrate great courage in his battle against Goliath. But to get a full, accurate picture of his courage and what courage is like, it's important to keep all this in the context of the whole story of David. Now, in session 1, we saw that God chose David to be the next king of Israel because he looked at the heart, not just outward appearances. And that's quite a contrast to Saul. If you go back and read earlier in 1 Samuel, a chief reason Saul was chosen to be king was because he looked the part. He was tall. He had that kind of regal attitude to him. But he didn't have what it took to be an effective king. Now, David, we learn, was also a handsome guy, but God chose him for his character. Well, now moving from 1 Samuel 16 to chapter 17 and the battle with Goliath, this story seems to intrude a little bit in the flow of the story. For example, 1 Samuel 17 verse 12 introduces David to the reader as if we've never met him before, have no idea who he is. At the end of chapter 16, David is serving Saul in his court as his musician. At the end of chapter 17, Saul doesn't seem to have any idea who David is. In chapter 16, David was anointed as the next king of Israel. But in 17, there isn't a hint that that has even occurred. And so you'll find that many modern scholars just tend to dismiss the story of David and Goliath as a legend or a fictional account. In fact, there's a very similar account in 2 Samuel 21 of a battle against a giant named Goliath. Only there, the man who defeats him, also from Bethlehem, is named Elhanan instead. And so these scholars assume that the victory that Elhanan won over Goliath was simply shifted to David, and David is given false credit for the battle. But most likely that's not the case, and especially not in a literary sense. Those two texts don't necessarily describe the same event, so that either had to be David or Elhanan. But more importantly, to dismiss chapter 17 misses the point of David's battle against Goliath and why it's told here. In the flow and context of David's story, 1 Samuel 17 plays an essential role. And to see how, we should first note that the chief role of ancient kings was to lead armies in war. In peacetime they had a little bit of administrative or governing work to do, but not much. When we get to session 5 of this study, we're going to look at 2 Samuel 11, which begins with this remarkable statement. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle. That's what they did. Farmers went to the fields, kings went to war. Well, in that light, then, we can see that Saul and his army were abysmal failures in 1 Samuel 17. Goliath comes out as the representative of the whole Philistine army, and he challenges any Israelite soldier to a one-on-one battle to resolve the whole conflict. And if you note carefully, he describes the Israelite soldiers as servants of Saul, not as Israelites or as servants of the Lord. Kind of rubs salt in the wound of Saul's inaction, his fear, his cowardice. But the truth is that Saul and all of his soldiers were terrified of Goliath. No one would take him on in battle. And interestingly, that includes David's brothers, which may just well explain why God did not choose any of them to be king in chapter 16. But David was anointed to be the next king in chapter 16 by God's specific choice. And so now as he comes to meet his brothers in the valley of Elah, Goliath's challenge marks David's first real chance to show his stuff, to demonstrate that he is in fact fit to be king. And in that light, when Saul tries to clothe David with his armor, it's actually quite symbolic. Saul was known to be very tall, and yet he never took on Goliath. But if David wore Saul's armor, he would be a stand-in for the king, even though he's much shorter than Saul. And yet that armor, of course, doesn't fit him. It's much too heavy and awkward for the young David. And so he diplomatically declines, gets out of wearing Saul's armor. And that differentiates him from Saul at every level. He's smaller, he's younger, he doesn't look the part, and yet he has the characteristics that Saul does not. And so instead, David heads out to take on Goliath with just his bag, his staff, and his slingshot. And as the readers, along with Saul and the Israelite army, were wondering, is that smart or stupid? Is it courageous, or is it a kind of suicidal ignorance of youth? Will David prove to be everything that Saul should have been, but was not? Or is he blinded by false bravado and overconfidence? The key question at the heart of the battle with Goliath is David's kingly character. Now, as we all know, he passed that test with flying colors. And as he did so, he showed the true character of courage in two key ways. On the one hand, David was highly motivated by his faith in the God of Israel. In verse 26, as he comes and sees the Israelite soldiers just standing around, he's just flummoxed. He looks around and asks, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? He can't believe it. And Francesca Murphy notes that use of the word, of that plural word, armies. Not the army of Israel, but the armies of Israel. Because elsewhere in the Old Testament, the armies of Israel include the hosts of heaven, the angelic armies of God, who fight alongside and on behalf of Israel. So David subtly reveals his faith that Israel is not fighting alone, but God and his angels fight alongside of them. And so David's courage to confront Goliath was centered in God, not in himself. And it seems that no one else in Israel's army, from Saul on down, had that insight of faith to motivate them. But on the other hand, and at the same time, David made full use of his own skills and experience and knowledge. He did not sit back passively waiting for God to slay Goliath on his behalf, but rather he showed great analysis of the situation, good strategy, and an awareness of Goliath's weaknesses. And here it's important to examine some of the finer details in this text. We all think about Goliath's huge size, and yet there's a lengthy description of his armor and his weapons. And if you add up the weight of all of that, it shows that it was so heavy that he could probably barely move. Not only that, despite his great size, he needs a shield bearer. He can't handle his own shield. Someone else has to be along to do that. Well, given his size and the weight of all that armor and weaponry, Goliath could not have moved effectively. And so it seems clear that he was sent out more to invoke fear in the Israelites than actually to fight a battle effectively. And of course, that deterrence of fear worked brilliantly for Saul and the soldiers of Israel, but not for David. If you look at verses 34 to 37 of chapter 17, David tells Saul, "Man, I've taken on bears and lions defending my sheep in the pasture." He had learned to spot vulnerabilities as well as recognize dangerous strengths in his enemies. And so David saw that, yes, Goliath was huge, but he couldn't move nimbly. In fact, again, if you look at verse 44, when David finally goes out to meet Goliath, Goliath says to him, "Come to me." Because Goliath couldn't go after David. He couldn't move anywhere near that well. Moreover, Goliath's enormous sword and spear offered no defense against a slung stone from David. And so there's this marvelous irony at work in this confrontation where Goliath sees David as contemptibly weak and small, and yet David actually had the advantage over him, over this fearsome warrior. And so in a way, like God himself in chapter 16, David looked beyond outward appearances. And so he saw the situation differently than any of his fellow Israelites. Yet even so, his trust rested in the Lord, not in his skills and analysis. In verse 37, David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will save me from this Philistine." In fact, David was so sure of that. His confidence was so centered in the Lord that he was puzzled that none of the other Israelite soldiers or even Saul himself had that same kind of confidence and motivation. Well, together, those two elements proved in action that David was indeed fit to be king in a way that Saul never was. Unlike Saul, he shows courage and initiative and motivation to fight against the enemy. And that drives David to action, not to fearful, passive inaction, which was always Saul's Achilles heel as long as he was king. But those two elements together, trust in the Lord and yet good use of his skills and experience, those two elements together also show how courage works for all believers, not just David. Courage is not some inherent quality or a trait that we can work on to develop, but it arises instead from good stewardship of the skills and experiences that God gives us, employed in the confidence of God's presence and power with us. And that means that any one of us is able to show great courage. Like David, we may not know when or how we'll have to show that courage until we arrive on whatever battlefield God puts us on. But in those situations, courage is a gift which God prepares within us in order to call it out of us when the time is right and the pressure is on. Well, David expressed exactly that faith, that kind of faith-based courage, in Psalm 27. He wrote, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Though an army encamp against me, yet my heart shall not fear. Though war rise up against me, yet I will be confident. For he, the Lord, will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will set me high on a rock." Here David confesses his undaunted courage in the face of fierce enemies and threats, and that he can do so only because he knows that the Lord is with him. Well, that promise of God's presence and power with us is the source of our courage, to harness all of our knowledge and skills and experience in order to go boldly against whatever enemies of God we may encounter. We'll enjoy some good conversation now with your small groups, and we'll look forward to seeing you for session 3.